Hello, my name is Connor Lund, and I will be your instructor for the Danbury High School dual credit section of Government 2305, Federal Government, for the fall 2017 semester. Normally, our class will meet on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in your second period, which I believe is from 8:48 to 9:33 a.m. However, today, as we are all aware, uh, we're going to be meeting, well, not just today, all of this week, we're going to be having these little online sessions. I will make 3 videos, one corresponding to each day of class. The second and third videos will both be a full 45 minutes, like your entire class would be. Maybe a bit shorter, maybe around 40 minutes. But it will basically be an entire class. This video today will be a bit shorter because we won't be doing any of the normal first day of class things. I won't be introducing myself any more than I already have, and I won't be going over the entire syllabus. I will save that for our first face-to-face class on Monday the 28th. If you have any questions, though, obviously you can't ask them of me right now, but if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at tlund, that's TLUND, at alvincollege.edu. So since we can't, since we can't meet today, and I can't do any of those other things, what I thought I would give you for this first video is a brief overview of the importance of the subject of American government and why it's important to study in order to understand. So first of all, I think it's kind of obvious importance why you should know something about it. We live in a republic where we vote, not always on particular issues, but on for or against politicians who will then go on to make laws and promote policy and things of that nature. And so it's important, if you want to be an informed, responsible member of society, that you know something about what government is and is not, what it can and cannot do, or should and should not do, what its powers are, what its weaknesses are, and all of those sorts of things. And a bit about what's going on in the country right now and has in the past. So the story of American government, and it is a story in a way, is a complicated one. There have been at various times in U.S. history different ideas about what government is, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to function. All of these things have come up for question. There are about 4 periods recognized for this sort of thing, 4 big periods. And the reason that's important to understand all of them, or to have some kind of working knowledge of all of them, is because it all comes up today. Because you might think, well, why do I care what someone thought 200 years ago versus 100 years ago versus whatever? How does that have to do with anything today? Well, it has a lot to do with things today. So, for instance, take into account the simple question. It seems like a very simple question, at least. Who makes law in the United States? Who is responsible? What part of government is responsible for making the laws that govern us, that govern all of us? Now, anyone who has even a passing familiarity with the Constitution will say, "Oh, well, it's supposed to be Congress, right?" Yes, because the Constitution gives the legislative power of government to Congress, and it's in 2 houses. We understand it's the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they both have to agree in order to pass a law. And that's the traditional way of understanding it, and that's true for the most part. However, there are all sorts of things that govern our lives that you can be thrown in jail for, that you can be fined for, that you can have all sorts of issues with the law over if you don't do this or do that or refrain from doing this or that. And they were never voted on by Congress. And you might rightly ask, well, how can they have the force of that if they haven't been voted on by Congress? Isn't Congress supposed to make the laws? Well, those are generally administrative regulations because we've decided uh, as a people, and then our government has decided many, many years ago that sometimes on certain specific things, it's better to have expert administrators make rules and have those basically govern our lives as if they were laws. Um, an example of this is recently, I say recently, within the past few years, the debate over the Affordable Care Act, what's commonly known as Obamacare. There was a very, very large debate over what was called the contraception mandate or contraceptive mandate. I'm not going to give you any opinion on it one way or the other, but one thing that very few people realize about the entire debate is that uh, the rule for forcing businesses and things like that to include and healthcare providers to include contraceptives as part of healthcare insurance plans was not in the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't something that was actually written in the law. It wasn't something that Congress ever voted on. It was this huge political issue that everyone seemed to have an opinion on, but very few people realized that it wasn't in the Affordable Care Act. The contraceptive mandate was something that came out of Health and Human Services. It came out of an administrative agency, and it had the force of law. And so it's important that you know the distinctions between these things and you understand about what's going on with that. And someone might say, well, I thought that Congress made the law, so how can this thing have the force of law? If not, well, the answer is, again, the story of American political development. And I'll get into a little bit of that, and that's going to cover most of the rest of this video. The first big period of American political thought would be broadly called the Founding Era. This is where we get the Declaration of Independence. This is where we get the original Constitution. And generally, could be described as a period of limited government with the promotion of rights. Now, rights of the individuals, that is. It would generally be characterized by a belief in what was called or what was known as the social compact theory or social contract theory. Doesn't really matter which word you use particularly, which is what you get from the Declaration of Independence. Why does government exist? Government exists for the purpose of protecting our rights. What are our rights? Our rights are generally life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, according to the Declaration. And that these rights are not secure without a government protecting us. If we were all just running around, we couldn't defend our own rights all the time. And so we come together and we create government for the purposes of protecting us, protecting our rights, keeping us alive, keeping us free, things of that nature. And that's pretty much full stop what government is for. It is a very, very limited form of government, and you might say rightly, well, we still talk about that a lot today. We talk about rights all the time. That's true. Which is a good aside for me to make at this point is that this was this founding era belief in social compact and rights and things of that sort were widely held. It was sort of consensus opinion from basically 1776 to the early 19th century. I'd probably say more than 50, about 50 years or so, up until the 1820s, 1830s. And then you have challenges. There's multiple challenges that come up. But anytime there's a challenge, obviously the reason is, well, we believe that the old way is wrong, or whatever, or the old way being whatever way came before us. And that's why you have a new theory of American government pop up, or develop rather. The point of, but what happens is you never have a complete overcoming. So obviously, like I said, anytime someone says, I don't like I don't like the way we do things, so I'm going to develop this new theory of American government, what government exists for, what it's supposed to do, things of that nature. You're going to create this competing system, and you're going to put that up against the system that came before it. Now, it has been successful a number of times in U.S. history, but it's never entirely successful. That's why, even though we have moved largely away from the principles of the founding, we don't really think of government the way that they thought of government in any meaningful sense. But at the same time, we still hold certain things to be very, very near and dear to us as a people. We very much believe in individual rights still. We still, at some level, believe in the importance of a written constitution and the structures of government that gives us. But at the same time, we still have those facets of this belief, but it's layered on with other things on top of it. These other competing systems that have come up over time. So, like I said, just a quick recap: the founding era, roughly from 1776, you can consider it from 1776 to the 1820s or 1830s, and primarily characterized by the social compact theory of government, which states that we have natural rights, individuals have natural rights, and that government exists and is created for the purpose of protecting those natural rights. Now, the first big challenge to that theory of government came in the first half of the 19th century with the increasing importance of slavery is in the South of the United States, especially. And they challenged the idea that people have natural rights, that individuals have natural rights, and that government exists to protect those. The in-depth details aren't particularly important, in large part because the arguments never really gained too much traction outside of the South. However, they were very, very influential in what later became, for a brief period of time, the Confederate States of America. And however, those were roundly refuted, in part by war, though there was a legitimate counter-opinion among about half the country for a period of time in the middle of the 19th century. However, there was a reassertion of the principles of the founding, spearheaded, at least initially, by Abraham Lincoln, and that more or less was the consensus opinion of most of America, of Americans in politics, up until the end of the 19th century. When you get to the end of the 19th century, into the beginning of the 20th century, you have what is generally referred to, at least by political scientists, as the progressive era. Now, the progressive era of government was the first big challenge that actually went somewhere, that really did change the game politically, changed the whole landscape of government in the United States. They had an idea of historical progress. The idea is that we're always moving forward. There is a march of history that inexorably is leading us in one direction. Even if there are setbacks here or there, we're constantly moving generally in one direction. And that rights, as such, are not really natural. They're not something that is innate to us. They're not something that's given to us by a creator, language that you hear in the Declaration of Independence. Instead, they're given to us by government, that the government itself is the creator of our rights, and that they could not exist without them. These progressives also were very interested in science and expertise. They thought that, and so instead of the sort of like what they would consider a low purpose of government being mere preservation, remember in the founding, the purpose of government was to protect us. It was to keep us alive. It was to keep us free in those senses. But for the progressives, they said, no, there's a higher purpose of government. That government isn't just supposed to make us safe so that we can live, but it's supposed to help us, in some sense, live well. And what I mean by that, what they meant by that, is that government is supposed to promote human flourishing in an active way. While the founders would have been all for human flourishing, they would have been more along the lines of thinking that government shouldn't interfere with people who are trying to do these sorts of things, whereas the progressives would say, no, the government is actually actively supposed to encourage this. Uh, this was coupled with a great faith in the scientific process and in scientific learning. And this is, as far as structures of government go, this is where we really get the beginning of the modern administrative state. The belief that that Congress and or the various state legislatures shouldn't really be making a lot of decisions about things like clean water, how to keep waterways clean, or how to keep air clean, things like that. And instead, what you should have is you should have an unbiased, apolitical administrative agency that will be given authority by Congress to do as it wishes within the confines of its mandate. So, if you have the Clean Air Act, and the mandate generally is to keep air clean. It's much more complicated than that, but for the sake of convenience, we'll say it's just keep air clean. It's like, okay, well then you have a bunch of scientists and various people who know a lot about environmental science and know a lot about things that might be related to it or pertinent to the mission of keeping the air clean or keeping the water clean or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And that they would make rules that then govern us, and they would have the force of law. And and like I said, just like with the founding, where we still have a lot of vestiges of the founding in a very important way with the Constitution and with our general structures of government and with our focus on rights and things like that. The progressives left their mark as well. We aren't strictly progressive anymore. They were very, very different from what we have now. They were very, very staunch moralists, for instance. They would much more staunch than the founding, and were into all sorts of strange things like eugenics. And so they aren't. We aren't progressive, at least in the sense of late 19th century, early 20th century progressivism. We aren't that anymore by any means, but there are still plenty of very, very important vestiges of that time that have made their place in American government. The biggest one, obviously, being the vast, vast administrative state that we have in this country. So that's another part of the puzzle that comes together. Now, we had that general idea of progressivism, which more or less dominated American political discourse until the 1960s. 1960 is a good year to talk about a switch. In the 1960s, you had a lot of uprisings. Not uprisings, a bad word. It sounds like a military movement. No, but you had a lot of rallies and general upswell of opinion, what can generally be called the New Left consensus, or people sometimes call neo-progressive, various things like that. It's where you got to move away from the very, very scientifically oriented and very moralistic progressives, and moved to what we generally think of now as far as normal American political discourse. This was characterized by things like feminism, by the sexual revolution, things of that sort. And they, like the progressives, like the Southerners in the antebellum period, in the middle of the 19th century, and like the progressives later, who set themselves up against the founding, as being the thing that they thought that they were better than. We're gonna get out the old and in with the new. So too did the in the 1960s. Did you have this movement that the progressives were the old and we need to get rid of the old and in with the new? Um, there was a reassertion of rights, but not in the sense of the founding. It was much broader. Many new rights or ideas of rights pervaded. You had lots of movements that had to do with race. This is whenever you had the rise, generally, of of what's race, class, and sex politics. Race being obviously civil rights movement and things of that sort. Class, um, economic class, the rich and the poor. Things more recently having to do with that. Occupy Wall Street, if any of you remember that. You might have been a little bit young at the time. The 99% versus the 1%, you might remember. And sex in the biological sense, not the act. Men and women, so things like feminism, particularly third wave feminism, uh, were during this period, and uh, and so this is where a lot of the modern debates come up. So things like same-sex marriage, for instance, is a debate that is distinctly post '60s. That was a gay rights movement, which is sort of like the civil rights movement in the sense that it's really a post 1960 political event. It wasn't something that you really had a whole lot of before then. And all of these things, these three big periods in American history, the founding, which had a bit of a bit more than a blip, but an argument against it and a refutation of that, and a vindication after the Civil War, up through the end of the 19th century, then the progressives up through more or less the middle of the 20th century, and then and then the modern American regime up until now. All three of these are important to understand what's going on now. If you don't understand one of them, then you can't really understand a lot of what's going on in American politics. Again, arguments over things like gun rights are clearly indicative that at some level the Constitution, specifically the Second Amendment, is still very, very important to people. It still holds a lot of sway in political discourse, even though it's been a long time since we've gotten away from the principles of the founding. And by the same token, we still, in a lot of ways, believe in the importance of expert administration in things like, keeping the air clean, keeping the water clean, keeping the airwaves regulated, things like that. Um, but the modern American regime is built on a backlash against a lot of that expertise-driven administration. And then obviously most of the political issues that we deal with now, in any kind of immediate sense, are issues that are uniquely something that has come up in the past 50 years or so. They weren't things that were widely debated, or at least if they were debated in very, very different terms before the 1960s. So you have to kind of understand all of these different things. Otherwise, you can't really understand the picture of American politics. Because again, like if you just try to understand one part of it, then you're really missing 2/3 of the puzzle, and you don't really understand what's going on. So it's important to keep all of that in mind, and as we go through the semester. A few words before I end this video. The You can check out the syllabus. I have uploaded it to Blackboard. Um, if you would like, you can print it out yourself, but I will be giving you a hard copy of that on the first day we meet. If you look through that, you'll see that we're going to cover about one chapter every week. of the textbook. There are 14 chapters in the textbook. There are about 14 weeks of class, not including things like Thanksgiving holiday and such. So we'll be covering that for the most part, with the exception of a bit in the middle of the semester. We'll be reading a chapter of the textbook. You'll be reading a chapter of the textbook over the weekend, and we'll spend the next week covering it. That'll be the case for the most part. Not always, but mostly. And again, I believe I mentioned this at the beginning. If I didn't, then I'll go ahead and mention it now. The textbook is going to be back at the college bookstore on. They'll get more copies on Thursday of this week, which is August the 24th. That's what I've been told. If I hear anything different, I will send out an email to the class letting you know. Since they are supposed to have something on Thursday, I would suggest you go by Thursday or Friday, get it early so that next week, whenever we meet for class the first time, you can go ahead and get started. Since we are going to be reading only since we'll be starting next week on our syllabus, that's starting with Chapter 2, please go ahead and read Chapter 1 and watch the second and third video where I'll be covering that chapter, as well as read Chapter 2 before Monday of next week. That's on the syllabus. Thank you, and please have a good day, and you'll hear my voice again in the second and third video whenever you decide to watch them.